The straw mattress cuts into your back, each stalk sharp as a needle, and the stink of smoke seeps from the rafters, mingling with sweat, stale ale, and the sour tang of a chamber pot shoved too close to the bed. The air is thick, damp, alive with the rasp of breath from bodies packed into one room. Your brother snores with a whistle at your side. Your mother mutters in her sleep across the chamber, and at your feet, the dog twitches, claws scraping against the rushes spread on the floor. You shift your weight, and the rope lattice beneath you groans so loudly, it feels like confession. Curtains hang limply around the bed, patched and thin, trembling when anyone passes. They are an illusion of privacy, nothing more. Every sigh carries, every gasp betrays you. A servant slips in with a jug, her eyes lowered, her silence complicit. She does not pause, because nothing in this space is secret. Families learn early that intimacy is a performance shared with an audience of kin, apprentices, and animals. In this world, even desire is communal. The night outside the shutters is no quieter. Horses shuffle in the yard. Somewhere down the lane, a drunkard slurs the fragments of a hymn. From the marketplace, laughter echoes, coarse and unashamed, before dissolving into the dark. Then the bells strike from the church tower, iron and absolute. It is the voice of God, or at least of priests who claim to know him, reminding you of the hours when passion is forbidden. Since the writings of St. Augustine in the 4th century, the Church has preached that pleasure itself is the wound of sin. Sex, they say, should be dutiful, mechanical, a means only to children. Fun is the proof of the fall. Yet the body does not wait for calendars or catechisms. The bed shifts again, ropes tightening, wood creaking, and someone in the dark exhales a sound not meant for prayer. You draw the blanket closer, the wool coarse against your fingers, your heart pounding, as though you too have been caught in the act. The world you inhabit has no locks, no boundaries, no doors that truly close. You will learn that in medieval life, sex is never a secret. It is a duty, a survival, and often a spectacle. The bell falls silent. The room stills. The fire pops once in the hearth, and in that pause, you understand the truth, sharper than the straw beneath your back. The danger in this world is not in the act itself. The danger is in being caught enjoying it. For the vast majority of people in the Middle Ages, sex unfolded in spaces that modern eyes would find unthinkable. Privacy was a rare luxury. Peasant families often shared a single room with parents, children, apprentices, and sometimes even animals all packed together. A bed, if there was one, might be a wooden frame laced with ropes, topped by a sack of straw, and covered with coarse linen. The creak of those ropes became a familiar sound, one that no household could ignore. Children grew up with the muffled rhythm of their parents' intimacy as part of the soundtrack of nightly life. What we would call embarrassing, they called ordinary. In towns like York or London, in the 13 and 1400s, the situation was no different. Apprentices crammed into shared dormitories. Lodgers rented space in the corners of other families' homes. And even wealthier households often had multiple people in a room. Curtains could be hung to create an illusion of privacy, but sound travelled, and silence was rare. In this crowded world, intimacy often spilled beyond doors. Lovers met in barns, in shadowed gardens, or in the winding alleys of the city. Records from York in the early 1300s mention complaints about couples being discovered in doorways and side streets, evidence that intimacy had no choice but to be public when walls were too thin. Marriage was not merely a sacrament, it was an economic necessity. For peasants, children were essential labourers, who would one day tend the fields or help with household trades. For townsfolk, children provided apprenticeships, income, and, security in old age. Intimacy was therefore less about passion and more about ensuring survival. Yet the practicality of marriage never erased the human hunger for desire. Even with sermons ringing in their ears, couples still found ways to steal pleasure in stolen hours, sometimes ignoring the church calendar that blocked nearly half the year with prohibitions on when intimacy could occur. The rhythm of daily life shaped everything. Work began at dawn and stretched until dusk. By nightfall, families gathered around the hearth, ate their meals, and crowded into sleeping spaces. It was in this setting, with children curled beside them and servants only steps away, that couples made do with what privacy they could find. Wealthier households sometimes afforded marriage beds, raised and curtained. But for the poor, a blanket on the floor might suffice. And so, medieval intimacy was neither hidden nor glamorous. It was practical, noisy, and woven into the fabric of survival. To live in this world was to know that desire had to coexist with the smells of smoke and sweat, with the shuffle of livestock, and with the constant presence of others. The question was never whether someone heard. The question was how little you cared when they did. If medieval homes were loud with desire, the church tried to smother that noise with rules. Cathedrals towered above villages and cities, stone giants casting shadows that reminded everyone of their spiritual overseers. The message was unrelenting. Sex was permitted only within marriage, and only when its purpose was clear. The creation of children. Anything beyond that was condemned as sinful indulgence. Confession manuals gave priests precise instructions. A married couple was not supposed to have intercourse on Sundays, feast days, or during holy seasons such as Lent and Advent. Add up the calendar, and nearly half the year was off limits. Position mattered as well. Only missionary was acceptable, since it symbolized the correct order of man above woman. Other positions subverted God's design. Even nudity was suspect. Churchmen warned that full disrobing fed lust, and that a couple should remain partly clothed, avoiding lascivious kisses or lingering embraces. Intimacy was meant to be joyless, a chore done out of duty, never delight. Theological reasoning stretched back centuries. In the late 4th and early 5th century, St. Augustine wrote that in Eden, sex would have been mechanical, a deliberate act of procreation without pleasure. Pleasure, in his eyes, was proof of sin's corruption. Later, in the 13th century, Thomas Aquinas expanded the logic in his Summa Theologica. He ranked sexual acts by their level of reason. Intercourse aimed at producing children was acceptable, though still dangerous if passion intruded. Kisses, caresses, or laughter that stirred lust were suspect. Acts that could not lead to children, such as oral or manual stimulation, were all branded as sodomy, regardless of whether they occurred inside marriage. Yet the lived reality was far messier. Ordinary people ignored many of these rules, and the clergy themselves often broke them. In the 14th century, parishioners in Prague reported priests keeping concubines openly, visiting sex workers regularly, and even running brothels out of their homes. One account describes a priest fleeing naked from a brothel during a raid, spotted by his own congregation. The same man likely stood in the pulpit the next morning, wagging his finger at laypeople for their sins. Hypocrisy was not an exception. It was a pattern. The contradictions bred a double life. In public, believers nodded along to sermons that thundered against lust. In private, they laughed, flirted, and pursued pleasure wherever it could be found. Every child born outside of feast days or church-approved nights was a quiet rebellion, a reminder that doctrine rarely kept pace with desire. The church's grip was powerful, but not absolute. Its cathedrals loomed like watchtowers. Its bells marked the hours of prohibition. But within the creaking rope beds and steaming bathhouses, people lived as they pleased. The distance between heaven's rules and earth's reality was measured not in sermons, but in the sound of laughter leaking through the walls of every medieval home. If the church sought to police intimacy through morality, medieval medicine tried to explain it through science, or at least the science of its age. Physicians in the 12th and 13th centuries leaned heavily on the ancient theories of Galen and Hippocrates, passed down through Arabic scholars and translated into Latin for European universities. At the core of these teachings was the idea of the four humours, the bodily fluids thought to govern health: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Balance was everything. Too much heat, too much cold, too much moisture, or too much dryness could twist the body toward illness, or, just as dangerously, toward unruly desire. One persistent belief was that women needed to experience pleasure in order to conceive. Medical treatises argued that female orgasm produced a vital seed that mingled with the man's, ensuring pregnancy. Without it, conception was considered unlikely. As a result, some physicians actually advised husbands to pay attention to their wives' enjoyment, a surprising departure from the Church's warnings against lust. The contradiction was stark. Theologians urged joyless duty, while doctors quietly admitted that pleasure had a biological function. Confession manuals provide glimpses into how these medical ideas filtered down to ordinary people. Around the turn of the 11th century, Bishop Burchard of Worms compiled a penitential that instructed priests on which sins to ask about during confession. Among the questions he proposed was one both scandalous and revealing. Had women ever crafted objects in the shape of male members, strapped them to their bodies, and used them on others? In other words, he knew sex toys existed. He wanted priests to confront penitents about them. This admission shows that even in an age dominated by fear of sin, people experimented with intimacy in ways that startled their confessors. Doctors also prescribed remedies for problems of desire. A man deemed impotent might be advised to eat warm, moist foods, such as leeks or garlic, to stoke his humours. A woman thought frigid might be given spiced wine to heat her body. Conversely, those accused of excessive lust might be cooled with lettuce or watercress. Everything was framed as chemistry, as though the body was an oven that could be stoked or dampened. At the same time, medicine blurred with superstition. Amulets, potions, and charms were sold to stir passion or soothe unwanted desire. Some relied on herbs, others on whispered prayers, and many on sheer imagination. The line between medical science and magic was never clear. What emerges from these records is a picture of medieval intimacy that was not only moral, but also medical. Pleasure was not simply indulgence. It was tied to fertility, to family, and to the delicate balance of humours. For every priest warning couples to keep their clothes on, there was a physician suggesting that pleasure might, in fact, be the very thing that created life. If there was one place in medieval towns where pleasure and scandal openly mingled, it was the bathhouse. Far from being rare, public baths dotted the cities of Europe in the 1300s and 1400s. Paris, London, and York each had districts where bathhouses operated as both cleansing stations and social clubs. Couples bathed together, friends gathered for conversation, and for many, it was simply a chance to escape the grime of daily life. Yet beneath the steam, intimacy often blurred into commerce. Language itself reveals the overlap. In England, laundresses and bathhouse attendants were sometimes called lavenders, a slang term that doubled as a euphemism for sex workers. Bathhouses became known as stews, a name that later applied directly to brothels. The connection was so strong that in the late 14th century, London authorities cracked down on the Southwark stews, formally regulating where and how sex could be sold. Officials preferred to tolerate and control the trade, rather than drive it underground. Regulation often came in the form of zoning. Cities designated particular streets for brothels, and their names still echo the business they once hosted. In York, Grape Lane took its name from grappling, a not-so-subtle hint about what occurred there. Other towns recorded similar names, direct and unapologetic. Far from hiding sex work, medieval communities incorporated it into the geography of the city. Clothing laws also marked sex workers publicly. In some cities, women in the trade were required to wear striped hoods. In others, red or yellow was mandated. In Vienna, regulations went further, demanding that sex workers wear small bells so they could be heard before they were seen. The intent was humiliation, but the effect was more complicated. Over time, women in the trade turned these markers into fashion statements. Platform shoes, bright fabrics, and flamboyant accessories became part of the culture, styles so striking that high-born ladies sometimes copied them. Once again, a profession treated with disdain also set trends. The bathhouse environment itself encouraged intimacy. Warm water, shared tubs, and perfumed oils created a sense of indulgence, rare in daily medieval life. For many poor women arriving from the countryside, working in these spaces was one of the few ways to earn significant income quickly. Marriage might provide security, but sex work could provide independence. The church thundered against it, but authorities tolerated it, knowing the trade could be taxed and controlled. By the late Middle Ages, sex work was as much a fixture of urban life as markets or cathedrals. For all the rules and shame attached, everyone knew where to find it, and everyone knew someone who made use of it. In the haze of bathhouse steam, morality blurred, and the reality of medieval pleasure became impossible to ignore. If peasants had to share their beds with family and servants, royalty faced a different problem: too many eyes. Kings and queens slept in chambers that symbolized wealth and power, yet those rooms were rarely private. Courtiers, attendants, and guards came and went freely. The royal bedchamber was a thoroughfare, a place of politics as much as rest. Intimacy, even here, was a performance witnessed by many. One of the finest surviving examples of a medieval royal bedroom comes from the Tower of London, where King Edward I, in the late 1300s, ordered a lavish bed built. Heavy curtains surrounded the frame, offering at least the illusion of privacy. Beds of this kind were expensive, carved from oak and draped with embroidered fabrics, meant to display wealth as much as comfort. Yet even with thick curtains drawn, attendants lingered nearby. To close the fabric was to gain space, not seclusion. The most dramatic example of public intimacy came during royal weddings. Across Europe, from the 12th to the 15th century, noble marriages required bedding ceremonies to prove legitimacy. In England, the ritual was particularly elaborate. After the feast, the bride and groom were escorted to their chamber. A priest blessed the bed. Then courtiers brought spiced wine, helping the couple into their nightclothes. Groomsmen and bridesmaids often climbed onto the mattress with them, tossing stockings at the couple, believing that striking them meant good fortune in marriage. Only when the merriment subsided did attendants draw the curtains and leave the couple to consummate the union. The point was not romance, but politics. For dynasties, heirs mattered more than pleasure. No consummation meant no legitimate marriage. In some cases, witnesses lingered close by, listening for proof that the act had taken place. Royal sex, far from private, was tied to the survival of kingdoms. The future of dynasties rested not on affection but on duty, a burden heavy on every royal bride. For nobles below the rank of king, the expectations were similar. Large households meant crowded bedchambers, where intimacy was conducted within earshot of servants. Even in wealth, privacy was scarce. Curtains and carved screens created layers of space, but none of them could silence sound. Servants fetching water, scribes waiting with letters, or guards posted outside, all formed a constant backdrop. In this sense, royalty lived under more scrutiny than peasants. A farm couple might find a shadowed barn for themselves. A king had no such freedom. His intimacy was tied to politics, his pleasure sacrificed to succession. Even his bed was not truly his own. It was a stage where heirs were demanded, dynasties secured, and kingdoms kept alive. If royal marriage was about heirs and survival, courtly love was about everything else. Emerging in the 12th century and flourishing through the 14th, the culture of courtly love filled the gap between duty and desire. It was a game of poetry, secret glances, and veiled confessions, often played out between married noblewomen and unmarried knights or courtiers. The rules of the game demanded longing, devotion, and often the promise of intimacy, but rarely within the bounds of marriage. Writers like Andreas Capellanus, who penned De Amore or The Art of Courtly Love in the late 12th century, laid out guidelines that seem strange today. Love, he insisted, was ennobling, but only if it was adulterous. A husband and wife could not truly experience courtly love because marriage was about property, alliance, and heirs. Real passion had to exist outside of those bonds. The poetry of the period reflects this tension. Verses brim with longing for forbidden women, praises of beauty, and elaborate metaphors comparing love to sickness or battle. Knights pledge service to their lady as if to a liege lord, swearing to endure humiliation or even death for a chance at her favour. Yet behind the stylized verses lay practical concerns. Adulterous relationships could destabilize dynasties. Legends of King Arthur capture the danger. When Queen Guinevere and Sir Lancelot cross the line from longing to consummation, Camelot itself collapses. Medieval literature repeatedly warns that procreative sex outside of marriage could unravel entire kingdoms. Desire was tolerated in song but dangerous in practice. Still, the boundaries were porous. Noble courts thrived on flirtation. Banquets echoed with songs of secret love. Troubadours composed verses that teased at scandal, and ladies accepted tokens from admirers with a smile that was never entirely innocent. In some cases, affairs did happen, slipping into the margins of history. Chroniclers rarely recorded them outright, but the very fact that so much literature dwelled on the subject suggests how common the temptation was. Courtly love also shaped ideas of sex itself. While the church condemned any act that could not produce children, courtly culture often encouraged precisely those acts. Lovers sought intimacy that would not threaten dynastic lines, favouring what theologians labelled as sodomy. Manuals may have banned such practices, but poems celebrated them in riddled metaphors. Here again was the great contradiction. The pulpit preached chastity, the poets praised desire. For the nobility, then, intimacy was not confined to marriage. It spilled into gardens, into whispered conversations at feasts, into letters tucked away in sleeves. It was the thrill of what was not allowed, the chase that mattered more than the catch. Courtly love was both a performance and a rebellion, a way for people bound by duty to indulge in longing, even when that longing threatened to undo the very order they lived within. For all the sermons about sin and restraint, medieval people delighted in bawdy jokes. Far from being prudish, their humour was often unashamedly sexual, crude, and playful. Laughter was a release, a counterweight to the heavy hand of church doctrine. And nowhere was this more evident than in the banqueting halls where nobles and commoners alike gathered to eat, drink, and swap stories. Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, written in the late 1300s, is perhaps the clearest surviving window into this culture of smut. In The Miller's Tale, a young wife tricks her older husband so she can sleep with her lodger. The story spirals into slapstick, ending with a fart joke and a prank involving a kiss in the dark gone hilariously wrong. To Chaucer's audience, which included nobles and courtiers. This was high entertainment. Far from being embarrassed, medieval listeners roared with laughter at crude scenes. Sexual humour was not hidden in taverns alone. It was a centerpiece of elite culture as well. Beyond literature, humour appeared in unexpected places. Manuscripts, copied by monks in monasteries, sometimes included obscene doodles in their margins. Rabbits wielding phalluses, nuns picking fruit from trees shaped like male members, grotesque hybrids locked in comical embraces. These were the cartoons of the Middle Ages. Scholars still puzzle over them, but they reveal a streak of playfulness that ran alongside solemn religious texts. Sacred and profane were often inked on the same page. Pilgrimage, too, carried its own layer of bawdy humour. From the 15th century, surviving badges show vulvas wearing crowns, carried on litters by little phalluses with legs and tails. Such images seem shocking today, but they circulated among pilgrims as tokens, blurring the lines between sacred journeys and earthy jokes. Some scholars argue they hinted at fertility hopes or cures for impotence. Others suggest they were simply meant to amuse. Either way, they show that sex was part of medieval humour, even in religious contexts. At feasts, ribald songs and puns filled the air. Lords and ladies competed to outdo one another with clever double meanings, often to the embarrassment of their guests. This openness reminds us that the history of sex is not a straight line from repression to liberation. In some ways, medieval people were far more comfortable laughing about intimacy than later generations would be. Humour gave them power. It turned forbidden subjects into shared amusement. It mocked hypocrisy, celebrated desire, and allowed everyone from peasants to princes to laugh at the very rules meant to contain them. For a society often caricatured as grim and joyless, the reality was far earthier and far funnier than we might expect. Beneath the rules of the church and the poetry of courtly love lay another reality that medieval records rarely intended to preserve: the lives of people we would now describe as queer or trans. Despite the heavy moral codes of the age, evidence shows that these lives were not only present, but sometimes openly acknowledged. One striking case comes from London in the year 1394. A sex worker named Eleanor Reichner was arrested for conducting business in the wrong part of the city. That detail alone reflects the strict zoning of sex work. But Eleanor's story holds a deeper resonance. Born John Reichner, she had lived as a woman for years, working both in London and Oxfordshire. When brought before the court, the authorities did not punish her for her gender identity, nor for the fact that she sold sex. The only offence recorded was the location of her work, which violated city regulations. If she had returned to the designated district near the Tower of London, her life could have continued as before. Eleanor's existence shows that what mattered most to the authorities was not identity but geography. Such stories remind us that medieval society did not fit neatly into our expectations of rigid intolerance. Sexual and gender diversity existed, even if not named in modern terms. While the Church condemned same-sex acts as sodomy, the enforcement was inconsistent, and evidence suggests that relationships outside heteronormative bounds were more common than surviving records admit. The penitentials, manuals written for priests in the 11th century, contain pointed questions about sexual acts between women, including the use of crafted devices. These texts were not written to celebrate such practices, but their very presence proves awareness. Priests asked because they knew such encounters occurred. By the 14th century, cases of men living as women, or women living as men, appear in scattered court documents, though often buried beneath legalistic language. Even art carried hints. Marginal illustrations in manuscripts occasionally depicted same-sex intimacy, with a playfulness that scholars still debate. Were these satirical? Were they condemnations? Or were they simply reflections of human curiosity? The ambiguity suggests that, while official doctrine thundered against difference, daily life was more complex. The story of Eleanor Reichner is especially revealing because it highlights tolerance within limits. Her punishment was not exile or death, but relocation. In her world, identity was not invisible. It was recognized, tolerated, and regulated, much like other aspects of medieval sexuality. These fragments remind us that the Middle Ages contained lives as varied as our own. Queer and trans individuals found ways to exist, to work, and to love, even if their voices only reach us now in whispers from court records and confessions. Beneath the shadow of cathedrals, they lived not as impossibilities, but as part of the crowded, complicated fabric of medieval society. For medieval people, sex was never just about pleasure. It was a force that shaped survival, inheritance, and the stability of entire societies. At every level of the social ladder, intimacy carried consequences that extended far beyond the bedroom. For peasants, marriage was not only a sacrament, but also a contract of survival. Life, in the countryside, demanded labour, and children were the hands that kept farms running. Sons ploughed the fields, daughters tended the animals, and both contributed to the household economy from a young age. Without children, the future of a family line withered. Intimacy, then, was directly tied to whether a family could endure another generation of hardship. A barren marriage was more than personal misfortune. It was a threat to survival. For women, sex often meant security. A respectable marriage was one of the few socially approved ways to gain stability, yet marriage itself was an economic transaction. Dowries, alliances, and expectations of fertility shaped a woman's prospects. Those without family wealth sometimes turned to sex work, one of the few trades where a woman could earn her own income. Though stigmatized, it gave independence to some who might otherwise have been trapped in servitude or poverty. Even the church, while condemning sex work in sermons, tolerated it in practice, recognizing that it was too entrenched to erase. For men, virility was tied to honor. To father children proved masculinity, strength, and status. Failure to do so could mean ridicule, or, in noble families, the loss of titles and land. Impotence trials in the 13th and 14th centuries illustrate this pressure. Husbands who could not consummate their marriages were paraded before witnesses, their failure made public, their reputations ruined. Fertility was not simply a private matter, it was a man's proof of worth. For kings and nobles, the stakes were even higher. Dynasties depended on heirs. A royal marriage without children could unravel alliances, spark wars, and topple kingdoms. The bedding ceremonies of Europe made this plain. A ruler's intimacy was never his own. It was a public act with political consequences. Queens, too, bore this burden. To fail at producing children was to invite whispers, annulments, or replacement. The union of two royal bodies was, in essence, the union of two states. In this way, sex in the Middle Ages was a kind of currency. It secured labour, ensured inheritance, stabilized dynasties, and defined reputations. It was not merely private indulgence, but a tool of survival, binding together the fate of peasants, prostitutes, nobles, and kings alike. To live in that world was to understand that desire was never free of consequence. It carried the weight of family survival, the honor of men, and the future of kingdoms. In every sense, intimacy was power, and power was survival. When we peel back the sermons, the rituals, and the myths, what remains is a portrait of medieval intimacy that feels both alien and familiar. It was a world where sex was everywhere and nowhere at once. Families crammed into single rooms where privacy was impossible. Priests thundered against pleasure, even as some slipped away to brothels. Physicians prescribed passion as medicine, while poets celebrated longing that was never meant to be fulfilled. In the bathhouses, bodies mingled in steam, laughter echoing through tiled chambers, where moral boundaries dissolved. In courtly halls, love songs praised desire forbidden by marriage, while bawdy jokes turned feasts into theatres of shared smut. Queens and kings carried the heaviest burdens, their wedding beds transformed into stages where dynasties were made or unmade. And on the margins, lives like Eleanor Reichner's remind us that identity was more complicated than the rules would ever admit. The contradictions are striking. This was an age that condemned lust yet laughed at it, that feared desire yet made it the centerpiece of poetry, that regulated sex work yet allowed it to shape the culture of cities. Intimacy was never free of consequence. For peasants, it meant survival, for women security, for men honor, and for rulers, the survival of kingdoms. In every case, sex was woven tightly into the fabric of life, not an indulgence hidden away, but a force that shaped labor, inheritance, politics, and reputation. Perhaps the greatest misconception about the Middle Ages is that they were prudish, 1,000 years of silence on matters of the flesh. The reality is far messier and far more human. Medieval people joked, schemed, lusted, and laughed as openly as we do, sometimes more so. They lived under rules that sought to tame desire, but desire has never bowed quietly to rules. So the next time you imagine the Middle Ages as grim and joyless, remember the steamy bathhouses, the raucous banquets, the whispered poems of longing, and the straw beds creaking in crowded rooms. Sex was not hidden in this world. It was survival, spectacle, and rebellion all at once. And if stories like this make you laugh, shiver, or rethink history, remember that there are more waiting. Subscribe, ring the bell, and join us as we uncover the hidden, uncomfortable, and unforgettable sides of the past. After all, history is never just dates and battles. Sometimes, it is the creak of rope beds and the laughter in the dark